Pakistan A303 is approaching Jinnah International Airport for a second attempt to land in Karachi, Pakistan. Oil is spilling out and low pressure warnings are blaring in the cockpit. The undercarriage of the plane is severely damaged and they have lost their both engines. What will happen to them? What will happen? How can they survive this crash? What are the mistakes done by the pilot? Let's see in this video. This is the scheduled flight from Lahore to Karachi. Lahore International Airport. PIA A303 is ready to take off. The passengers are boarding. Passengers are boarding PIA A303. Everything is ready. PIA A303 is now accelerating to take off. Like this, the journey of PIA A303 has started. They don't know what is going to happen and what disaster is going to come. PIA A303 takeoffs. Landing gear up. V1 rotate. The plane which is currently used is a 16-year-old Airbus A320. It was manufactured and delivered to PIA in 2004. Maintenance checks were being carried and the plane was in good condition. The plane was installed with two brand new CFM56 turbofan engines. Today, the first officer is the pilot flying and the captain is the pilot monitoring. The captain is 58-year-old Sajjad Gul. He joined PIA in 1996 and was promoted. The first officer was Usman Azam. He was 33 years old and with significantly less experience compared to the captain. Azam had joined the airline in 2010 and he had around 2,300 hours of flying experience. The plane is now flying and cruising at an altitude of 34,000 feet. The skies are clear. The weather is calm. It's a perfect day for flying. They are supposed to hit an waypoint named Mackley at an altitude of 8,000 feet. 4 nautical miles after Mackley is another point called Saben. They'll need to do a holding pattern to reduce the altitude from 8,000 feet to 3,000 feet. They don't know it yet, but their first problem has just started. The crew has skipped their mandatory approach briefing. The first officer enabled the Nawab Shah 2A approach on the flight computer. Since the crew are busy talking about things unrelated to the flight, the captain doesn't cross-verify this change. The first officer calls up to the ATC to request permission to descend. ATC Pakistan 8303 descend flight level 100. Pilot discretion proceed direct Mackley. Because there are not many planes in the air, the ACT decides to give them a shortcut, although they were originally cleared for this route. The ATC now permits them to skip Hyderabad and fly directly to Mackley. This new route is called Nawab Shah 1C. They have also been cleared to descend to FL 100. The first officer changes the altitude assignment in the autopilot. The pilot should do a cross check. One pilot makes a mistake, the other pilot can identify it and correct it before it comes to a significant problem. But this crew just didn't care. This behavior is going to take a dark turn. The pilot set up the autopilot to follow a managed descent. In this mode, the autopilot will calculate a path taking into consideration the total number of track miles left to fly, the speed at which the pilot wants to fly, at any altitude, restrictions that are present for any waypoints along the route. Usually in this mode, everything is set up clearly. The plane should descend at a rate of 2000 feet per minute. This plane, though it is only descending at 1000 feet per minute, as slower descent usually happens. When the computer thinks there is a long way to go to the airport, but given they are less than 150 nm from the airport, the plane should have started a proper descent already. Why does the plane think there's longer to fly when there is less than 150 nm left? After a while, the plane now hits the point where it thinks it needs to start the descent from. The engines are brought back to idle and the plane begins to descend at 2400 feet per minute. Karachi ATC clears them down to 5000 feet. Once again, the first officer silently changes the altitude target to 5000 feet in the autopilot. There is no cross verification or verbal confirmation done by the crew, usually at this point in the flight. The plane is handed off from Karachi area control to Karachi approach control. Out of habit and without clearance, one of the pilots changes the frequency on the radio box, and not only they changed the frequency without approval. They also entered the incorrect frequency. Instead of 125.5, the crew entered 126.5. This meant that the ATC wasn't able to contact the plane at all. After about 5 wasted minutes, the ATC was able to contact them plane by calling them on the guard frequency. Karachi approach clears them to descend further to 3000 feet. Since the plane has descending late, it's extremely high compared to where they should be for a straight in approach. The crew still isn't aware though. All they needed to do was to pay attention to the screens in front of them. To see the U-turn indicator at SABEN or for the word hold in the FMC, but since they were not following procedure, they completely missed this. The plane is now around 5 minutes away from the airport. Makli weak point, and it then crosses Makli at 9300 feet. They should have been at 3000 feet by now. They are too high to land safely, but all's not lost as long as the pilots don't do anything. And led by the plane, follow the computed path, the plane will simply execute to the holding pattern. A minute later, with the runway in view, The first officer arms the approach mode to make the plane capture the glide slope. But in this mode, once the glide slope is captured, the computer will ignore all programmed navigations, including the hold at SABEN. And without this hold, the plane will continue to be too high when it reaches the airport. Karachi ATC, who is monitoring the plane's path, notices that they are more than twice altitude as they are supposed to be at and gets concerned. He calls out to the plane, Pakistan 8303, confirm track mile, comfortable for descent, to which the crew responds, affirm. This call must have awakened the captain, and he must be have wondered why such a question was being asked. So he checks the screens in front of them. Only then does he realize their mistake. They haven't removed the holding pattern at SABEN. He becomes alarmed. What has happened? Stop, stop. Oh no. Take out the hold. Take out the hold. Take out the hold. But the hold was only thing that was going to get the plane down to the runway in time. The first officer then asked the captain, hold taken out. Should we report this issue? The captain says no, overrules the first officer and instructs him to tell the ETC that everything is fine. The first officer agrees with his senior and relays it to Karachi ATC. Remember the steep power gradient that we initially discussed. That's now influencing in the first officer's decisions here. The first officer, fully aware that they goofed up and can visibly see that they are too high. In the past few months, prior to this flight, there were numerous flights where the captain flew with high speeds, high path, height, rate of descent and GPWS warnings and no go arounds. After a minute later, the landing gears are set down at 7,400 feet and the flaps are to flaps 1. The vertical speed increases from 2,300 feet per minute to an astonishing 7,500 feet. Per minute. This is a ridiculously extreme angle to be approaching the runway. The approach controller, who is still worried, reminds them with Sir. Orbit is available if you want, saying that they could make a 360-degree turn to lose altitude, get back to the normal flight path. The captain sees no issue with their approach and tells the first officer to say no. The officer responds, negative, sir. We are comfortable. The plane crosses 4,500 feet, just 7 miles away from the runway. Since the target altitude set in the autopilot is 3,000 feet, the plane begins to reduce its descent level to off at 3,000 feet. At almost the same time, the captain says he will be surprised. What have we done? The plane was going down at a speed of 7,400 feet per minute to 2,000 feet per minute. In an attempt to stabilize the approach, the first officer pulls the side stick of the plane and reduces the descent rate from 7,400 feet per minute to 2,000 feet per minute. In an attempt to stabilize the approach and possibility of the orbit, The first officer retracts the landing gear and freed brakes. But no verbal communication was done between the pilots, and captain isn't aware that the wheels are retracted. The first officer asks the captain whether they should do a 360-degree turn. The captain overrules him, yelling, "No, no, leave it." The captain then immediately takes over and controls the plane by pressing the red button on the side sticks. The plane down towards the runway just at the same time. The ATC clears the plane to land on runway 25L. The captain, who's mentally prepared to land, moves the flaps to the flaps 2 position to increase the drag to slow down the plane further. The plane now enters what's called 1000 feet stabilization gate. It's the point at which the plane should be absolutely stabilized in order to carry out the landing. But in this plane, the airspeed and vertical speed, the pitch and glide slope were out of the range. The plane was absolutely unstabilized and they should do a go around. The plane is now at 750 feet in altitude, so just 1.5 miles from the runway. As the plane kept going down, more too low terrain, sink rate and pull-up warnings were triggered. The landing gear is still up. The plane has crossed the threshold at 200 knots. Because the plane was too fast, it completely overshot the touchdown zone. The landing gear was still up. The plane touches down. As the plane impacts the ground, the entire plane starts vibrating. The engines begin to scrape along. The plane bounces up to 4 times, scraping and creating sparks every time. The captain continues to push the side stick down. The first officer was pulling up the side stick. The major trouble the plane is in hesitantly pulls his side stick back 2/3 of the way. When 2 different inputs are provided, the plane takes the average of 2 inputs. And so the plane continues to go further into ground. This causes the plane to lean towards the right, making the number 2 engine touch the ground for a prolonged period, scraping it on the ground and causing a fire it to sustain a significant damage. A fire erupts on engines. Electrical systems are switched over from engine 2 to engine 1. The first officer shouts, "Take off, sir! Take off, sir!" 2 seconds later, the captain advances the thrusters to toga mode, and since the already at 160 knots, the plane gets airborne again. Almost immediately, engine 1 had to do all the heavy lifting to get the plane back in the air. The first officer informed the ATC that we are going around, but the ATC had seen the belly landing and a fully fledged emergency was already initiated in the airport. As the crew retracted the flaps, engine 2 went from an auto start mode and began to recover. Because of the prolonged engines scrapping on the runway, a major hole had formed and all the fuel was leaking. As the pressure plane crossed 1200 feet, low oil pressure warnings for both of the engines were triggered. The master caution warning also lit up, putting immense pressure on the two pilots. In order to focus, the crew cancelled the warnings and made a decision to go to 3000 feet. ATC then instructs them to turn left at 110 degrees and to level off at 3000 feet. At about the same time, due to the severe impact it had undergone, engine 1 fails. Remember, engine was only the equipment powering all the electrical equipment. There was a ram on the plane. All they have was only ram. But thankfully, the engine 2, who was attempt to auto restart, successfully begins to turn on. But sadly, first officer notices the earlier fire warning for engine 2 and moves the engine 2 to idle. The crew then requests to maintain a clearance at 2000 feet, which is clear. And the first officers replied, "We are cleared." Almost at the same time, engine 2 also shuts down due to previous change. The first officer calls out, "Mayday, mayday, mayday," as the plane descends to 700 feet. Soon after, "Stall, stall," warning blares in the cockpit as the plane turns toward the runway. The Karachi controller then informs them, and the cockpit was full of tense and confusing with all sorts of warnings going off simultaneously. As the plane descends through 4000 feet, don't take flaps, obviously trying to avoid an extra drag. But with the gear hanging at 240.18 seconds, the plane crashed into a densely populated residential area, Modal Colony, about 1300 meters short of runway 25 left. The plane immediately broke apart and an intense fire erupted, which also engulfed several buildings around the crash site. Only 2 people survived this crash, and another person on the ground was fatally injured. Emergency services were impeded by the narrow streets and the crowd of locals who were trying to help. The final report found the cause of the crash to be the non-adherence of the rules and regulations by the crew. They have also found that the pilots fasting could have been a secondary contributor, as they may have reduced the spatial awareness. Flying while fasting rule has been fixed by Pakistan International Airlines. During the investigation, the it was also found that a shocking 40% of flying pilots in Pakistan were flying with fake flying licenses. This resolution caused Pakistan International Airlines to be blacklisted by the both EU and USA. If you like today's video, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. So please like, share, subscribe, and that's it for today's video, and bye bye, stay safe.